The first thing that should have been there was a voice. In the frozen wilderness of northern Canada, silence was never unusual. The land itself seemed built for it. Wind moved across the rocks and low tundra. Snow absorbed footsteps. A distant lake could disappear beneath ice until it looked less like water and more like another sheet of pale, endless ground. But according to a story that began circulating in newspapers in late 1930, one traveler arrived at a small Inuit settlement near Lake Anjikuni and heard nothing at all. No voices, no dogs barking, no people moving between shelters. No signs that anyone was preparing for the brutal northern winter. The settlement was simply empty. The story would eventually become one of the most famous tales of a village vanishing without a trace. Later versions would add abandoned meals, unfinished clothing, dead sled dogs, disturbed graves, mysterious lights in the sky, and an investigation by the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. Eventually, the story became connected to UFOs, but there is a problem. The more closely the story is investigated, the less certain the original disappearance becomes, and that creates a different kind of mystery, because the real question may not be, where did the villagers go? It may be, did this village ever disappear in the way the story says it did? To understand how that question became so difficult to answer, we have to go back to the beginning. Northern Canada in the early 20th century was a world that most people living farther south could barely imagine. There were no paved roads stretching toward the horizon, no highways crossing the wilderness, no modern communication network connecting isolated communities within minutes. Travel could depend on weather, sleds, boats, and knowledge of a landscape that could become dangerous with very little warning. Lake Anjikuni was part of that enormous northern environment. The lake lies in what is now Nunavut, although in 1930, the region was administered as part of the Northwest Territories. It was a remote landscape of water, rock, tundra, and seasonal movement. For Inuit communities, however, remoteness did not mean emptiness. The land was part of a network of hunting grounds, fishing areas, travel routes, seasonal camps, and communities whose movements made sense within the environment, even when they appeared mysterious to outsiders. That distinction matters. Modern retellings often imagine a permanent village sitting beside the lake, like a tiny northern town, with rows of homes and dozens or hundreds of people living there continuously. But the historical record does not support that simple picture, and this is where the legend begins to separate from the landscape that produced it. The first published version that researchers have been able to trace appeared in an American newspaper in November 1930. The journalist was Emmett E. Kelleher, and the story concerned a trapper named Joe LaBelle. According to the article, LaBelle had encountered an abandoned Inuit camp near Lake Anjikuni. The settlement was said to contain only a small number of people, roughly 25 men, women, and children in the earliest version. That number would grow dramatically in later retellings, but the original story was already strange enough. LaBelle supposedly arrived expecting to find people. Instead, he found an empty camp. There were signs that people had been there: clothing, equipment, food, shelter, the ordinary objects of daily life. But the people themselves were missing. There was no explanation attached to the disappearance, no obvious trail leading away, no known destination, no account of a planned migration. The story presented the scene as though an entire community had simply stopped existing, and that was enough to capture attention. Newspapers in the early 20th century understood the power of an unexplained disappearance. A missing person was a tragedy, a missing village was a mystery, and a missing village in the Arctic was almost irresistible. The landscape itself seemed to become part of the story. Imagine arriving after days of travel through a frozen wilderness and seeing shelters standing in the snow. You call out, nothing. You walk closer, still nothing. You enter one of the structures. There are objects that suggest ordinary life. Perhaps someone had been preparing food. Perhaps clothing had been left unfinished. Perhaps tools remained behind. The unsettling part was not that the place looked destroyed. It was that it supposedly looked interrupted, as if life had paused. That detail became one of the strongest elements of the legend. The people had not supposedly packed their possessions and departed. They had simply vanished. But even in the earliest account, there were problems. The story did not come from a police report. It did not begin with a surviving villager. It did not begin with a government investigation. It began as a newspaper story, and newspapers were not neutral databases of historical truth. They depended on information supplied by people, often at a distance, and sensational stories could travel quickly from one publication to another. The original article itself became difficult to locate and verify for decades. That would become important later. For the moment, however, the story continued to grow. As it was repeated, new details appeared. Some versions described unfinished garments with needles still attached. Others claimed that food had been left near fires. The number of missing people changed, the physical description of the settlement changed, and perhaps most importantly, the story acquired a darker detail: the dogs. According to later versions, several sled dogs had been left behind. Some were supposedly found dead from starvation. That detail made the story feel almost impossible to explain. Sled dogs were not decorative animals in the Arctic. They were essential working animals. They were transportation. They were part of survival. Leaving them behind would have made little sense if people had simply decided to travel somewhere else. But there is an important difference between a detail being compelling and a detail being documented. The further the story traveled from its original newspaper account, the more dramatic it became, and then came the graves. Later accounts claimed that a burial site near the settlement had been disturbed. The graves were supposedly opened. The remains were gone. This transformed the story from a strange disappearance into something almost supernatural. If the villagers had left voluntarily, why would they abandon their homes? If they had fled suddenly, why would they leave essential supplies? If they had been forced away, where were the attackers? And if they had died, where were the bodies? Then there was another question. Why had the graves allegedly been disturbed? The mystery seemed to have no natural direction. Every possible explanation created another problem, but the strangest additions were still ahead. In later versions, people in the region supposedly saw unusual lights moving across the northern sky. The lights were described as unlike the aurora. Some accounts turned those lights into a strange object. Others described a glowing craft. Eventually, UFO writers connected the lights to the disappearance itself. The theory was extraordinary. Perhaps the villagers had not fled. Perhaps they had not died. Perhaps they had been taken. The Arctic wilderness became the setting for one of the most unusual alien abduction stories of the 20th century, but none of that was present in the earliest version of the story. In the way later retellings suggested, the UFO element was an addition, and once it entered the story, it was almost impossible to remove. By the middle of the 20th century, the mystery had found a new life. American writer Frank Edwards included the story in his 1959 book, Stranger Than Science. Edwards was known for collecting unusual and unexplained stories, and his books helped spread mysteries to a huge audience. The Anjikuni story fit perfectly: a remote Arctic lake, a vanished community, empty shelters, dead dogs, disturbed graves, strange lights, an investigation that supposedly found nothing. It sounded like a case where science had reached the edge of what it could explain, but the real history was becoming harder to distinguish from the legend. The number of missing people increased in some later accounts from a few dozen to hundreds, and eventually even more exaggerated figures appeared. The village itself became larger. The mystery became more elaborate. Details that were not part of the earliest report began appearing as though they had always been there. This is one of the most important patterns in mystery stories. A story can become more believable as it becomes more detailed. That sounds backwards. More details should mean more evidence, right? Not necessarily. If every retelling adds one more detail, the story begins to feel documented because there are so many things to visualize. An unfinished shirt, a cold fireplace, an empty grave, a line of dead dogs, a strange light, a police search. Each detail creates an image. Together, they create an atmosphere. But atmosphere is not evidence, and when researchers eventually began examining the Anjikuni story closely, they found something important. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police did not have the kind of case file that the legend suggested. The RCMP itself now lists the Anjikuni story as an urban legend. According to the force's historical material, there is no evidence supporting the claim that an Inuit village near Lake Anjikuni disappeared in the 1930s. The RCMP also states that its patrols in the region recorded no unusual event of the kind described by the legend. That statement changes everything, because if the police never investigated a mass disappearance, then the famous image of Mounties riding into the Arctic to search for dozens of missing villagers becomes part of the mythology rather than established history. But there is an even more interesting problem. The RCMP's modern explanation is not the same as saying that nobody ever reported such an event. A newspaper article really did exist. That matters. Researchers once believed the story might have originated entirely with Frank Edwards in 1959, but later investigation traced an earlier account to November 1930. That means the story was circulating decades before Edwards published it, so the mystery is not simply a modern invention. Something was reported. The question is what? The earliest version attributed to journalist Emmett E. Kelleher described Joe LaBelle finding an empty Inuit camp near Lake Anjikuni. It gave a population of roughly 25 people and described abandoned belongings. Later retellings expanded the story substantially. This leaves us with an uncomfortable middle ground. The story is not completely invented in the sense that someone in 1959 simply created the entire thing from nothing, but the evidence does not establish that an entire village actually vanished. There was a report, there was a real region, there was a real trapper named Joe LaBelle, and there was a newspaper journalist named Emmett Kelleher, but the central event remains unsupported. To understand why, we need to look more closely at LaBelle. The legend describes him as an experienced trapper familiar with the region. region. That makes the story sound authoritative. A seasoned wilderness traveler would supposedly know the difference between an ordinary abandoned camp and something truly unusual. But the historical investigation raised questions about his background. An RCMP report from January 1931 reportedly found no foundation for the story and questioned the claim that LaBelle had long experience in the territory. According to the report, he had obtained his first trapping license that season. That does not prove LaBelle lied. A first recorded license does not prove someone had never traveled in an area before. People can work, travel, hunt, trade, or move through remote regions without every part of their history appearing in official records. So this clue should be treated carefully. It weakens the certainty of the newspaper's description. It does not solve the mystery. Then there is the journalist. Emmett Kelleher had a reputation for colorful reporting. That is important because the story's first form already contained dramatic language. A newspaper does not necessarily reproduce the precise language of a police investigation. It turns information into a readable story, and the headline itself was designed to attract attention. That does not mean every detail was fabricated. It means the source deserves scrutiny. Then another strange clue appeared. One of the images associated with later versions of the story was not actually a photograph of the missing settlement. Researchers traced it to an older image. That is significant because photographs often function as visual proof. If viewers see a picture of an abandoned northern camp while hearing a story about Anjikuni, the natural assumption is that the photograph shows Anjikuni. But if it was taken years earlier and somewhere else, the image is not evidence of the disappearance. It is illustration, and that is one way legends become stronger than their original sources. A photograph gets attached, a headline gets repeated, a dramatic detail becomes accepted as fact. Then another writer quotes the previous writer. Eventually, the story has dozens of sources, but all those sources may ultimately lead back to the same original newspaper article. 20 retellings do not create 20 independent confirmations. They create an echo. The Anjikuni story is a remarkable example of that process. For decades, the echo became louder. Books repeated it, magazine articles repeated it, UFO writers expanded it, mystery programs popularized it. Eventually, internet pages reproduced the most dramatic version as if it were an established historical case. The number of missing villagers became larger. The abandoned settlement became more permanent. The strange lights became more prominent. The police investigation became more dramatic. And the mystery appeared stronger with every repetition. But when researchers went backward instead of forward, when they stripped away the later additions and returned to the earliest traceable report, the story became much smaller, 25 people instead of thousands, a camp instead of a large permanent village, a newspaper account instead of an official investigation, a report instead of a confirmed disappearance. That is a very different mystery, and yet it still leaves questions. Could a small Inuit camp have been abandoned? Absolutely. Would that have been unusual? Not necessarily. Seasonal movement was part of life in the north. People moved according to hunting conditions, weather, food availability, and other practical considerations. A settlement that looked abandoned to an outsider might not have represented a mass disappearance at all. It might have been a temporary camp that had been left for another location. That possibility does not explain every detail attributed to the story, but it offers something important. A plausible natural explanation does not have to explain details that were added decades later. If the strange lights, opened graves, and starving dogs cannot be established in the earliest evidence, they cannot be used as proof that an ordinary explanation is impossible. This is where the story becomes less like a supernatural mystery and more like a lesson in historical investigation. The first question is not, what supernatural force could explain this? The first question is, what do we actually know happened? That sounds simple. It is not, because once a dramatic story has been repeated for nearly a century, separating fact from folklore becomes difficult. Take the famous population figures. Some modern versions claim hundreds of people disappeared, others have claimed thousands. But the earliest published account gave a much smaller number. The larger numbers are therefore not evidence of a larger disappearance. They are evidence of the story growing. The same thing happened with the UFO element. The strange lights were not part of the earliest account in the way later UFO literature presented them. Researchers have traced the more elaborate descriptions of mysterious objects and witnesses to later publications. That means the supposed connection between the lights and the missing villagers is not established historical evidence. It is a later interpretation, and once that distinction is made, the famous alien abduction theory becomes extremely weak. There is no verified evidence that extraterrestrials were involved. There is no confirmed record of a spacecraft. There is no verified record of villagers being taken. There is no physical evidence connecting UFOs to Anjikuni. Anjikuni. The theory exists because the story is mysterious enough to invite it, but possibility is not proof. The same problem affects darker theories. Some versions suggest the villagers were attacked, others suggest they were killed. Some imply that bodies were removed. Some imagine an unknown natural disaster, others suggest an unexplained atmospheric event. But without reliable evidence of bodies, injuries, weapons, destruction, or witnesses, these theories remain speculation. The strongest evidence points in a much less dramatic direction. The story itself is the phenomenon, not necessarily the disappearance. Think about what happened after 1930. A newspaper reported an unusual abandoned camp. The story spread. The details became more dramatic. Later, authors treated those details as established facts. Readers encountered the later version and assumed it described the original event. Then researchers investigated the later version and found inconsistencies. The mystery was therefore partly created by the process of retelling. But there is still one question that refuses to disappear. Why would anyone report such a story in the first place? Perhaps LaBelle genuinely encountered an abandoned camp. Perhaps Kelleher misunderstood what he had been told. Perhaps the story combined several separate northern events. Perhaps details were exaggerated by the newspaper.